we are ready to return to the topic of climate and solutions-based reporting. It's my pleasure to introduce our third and final session on climate change as a journalistic topic, experiences from Germany and Czechia. This is in cooperation with the Czech-German Future Fund. So it's my pleasure to introduce Simona and Sven, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves and give us insight into the work that they do. So Simona, love to turn it over to you to introduce yourself and tell us about your work, what you do in the Czech Republic.
Mm-hmm. Hello, good evening here, or morning maybe. My name is Simona Fendrychova. I'm a Prague-based journalist. I've been working for one of the biggest online daily called Aktuálně.cz, and I've been working there for 5 or 6 years. I'm a foreign desk reporter, which means I cover mainly international events, politics, and things like that. At the beginning, you have to do pretty much everything. And recently I got to write about climate-related issues because it's like getting bigger and bigger, this topic, even here in Czech.
Great. And Sven, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work, and then we'll just open it up for conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Fara, and thank you to the organizers of Prague Media Point. It's good to be back, albeit only digitally. Last year, obviously, that was much more enjoyable being on the ground, but I'm glad to be with you again. I'm Sven Egenter, the editor-in-chief and founder of the Clean Energy Wire, CLEW, as we called it. We are a non-profit foundation-funded media service, and we cover the German energy transition story, as one of the big solution stories to the climate change challenge. And we do it in a way, and I'll explain that a little bit later, I guess, that it creates some sort of international spillover effect. So the solutions and the flaws, get picked up properly, and we get the solutions in journalism on this particular important element of climate mitigation.
Great. Thanks so much. Simona, when we spoke, feels like weeks ago, but it was only a few days ago. One of the things I was really interested in is how you are bringing this topic of climate and climate coverage to a mainstream audience in the Czech Republic. Even here in the United States, sometimes the coverage of climate can be either highly politicized. It can be, as we've talked about, the kind of apocalyptic problem-based reporting. And it can also sometimes be very narrow. People who are interested in it are interested, and other people tend to not pay as much attention. So maybe you could talk about how you're bringing more information and journalism to a mainstream audience in the Czech Republic.
Yeah, it's really about finding a balance between very political topic and very scientific topic, because you can see in news there's like a flood of news about rising temperatures and new scientific papers and IPCC reports, which is full of data that needs to be translated to ordinary people, I would say. So we try to take a more systematic approach, and thanks to that we have like more time to devote it to the topic, to understand it better, even for journalists, even for the readers. And every newspaper has its own logic. It works like, for example, 5 years ago there was this refugee crisis which overshadowed pretty much everything. But the climate change topic is getting bigger and bigger, and nowadays there is actually nothing that would overshadow it, not even the pandemic. But to bring it to the mainstream, it's quite difficult, because you have competition, of course, and so we started this approach to instead of like publishing news, which is mainly bad news, we try to explain people what's happening with our planet by talking to real people with their experience. For example, we published a series of reports of how Czech cities are adapting to climate change, and of how, for example, instead of writing about rising temperatures, you can visit a farmer who started growing exotic fruits because he lives in the part of Czech Republic where it's getting hotter and hotter. And we also use a lot of graphics, because if you work for an online media, online newspaper, you have to take advantage of it, and you have to do your job in more appealing way through graphics, for example.
Great, thank you. So Sven, and I'm just gonna, maybe we can toggle back and forth between you and Simona. Sven, you in many ways sit in a different space with clean energy and wire. Maybe talk us through sort of how you see covering the climate crisis, what your focus is, and really how we think about what's working versus the consistent narrative that seems to be like what's not working.
Sure. Basically, we focus all our work, if you want, on looking at, the solutions. We take climate change and the facts of climate change as the baseline scenario of our work, in the sense that, we ask the question, what do we need to do to get carbon emissions down to keep climate change in check? That's basically the core assumption behind our work. And then we start looking at the German examples, the energy transition in all sectors, in the energy sector, renewables, we're talking about coal. I have a nice example for that later, how we do that. And, all the other sectors, mobility, agriculture, we look at heavy industries, how they can decarbonize, awful word, but actually it only means, get rid of their carbon, their CO2 emissions, the greenhouse gases. But we do more than only the reporting. We want to be the sort of intermediary for other international journalists to work with that material. And that means we make ourselves as, expert journalists available. So we, if we publish a story and you find it interesting, we would, you could ask us anything you need, or maybe if you want to follow up on a certain source we used, we make everything as transparent as we can. So you can just drop us an email and say, look, you wrote something on this new battery technology that can help balance, renewables. Whom can I talk to? And then we make our expertise, we make our contacts available. We try to help, and we do that in all sorts of forms. We also organize workshops around that. And we've created a network where we hope that the journalists in this network do the same thing as we do, with their fellow journalists across the world. So if you go on our website, you'll find all these dots spread around the world where we would encourage a sort of collaborative journalism. So we think that if you keep a close eye on the important policy decisions that foster solutions like the energy transition, and if you follow that, track that as a journalist, but also keep always asking, what's next, which parts did work and which parts didn't work, and be honest about that, then I think you can make a great contribution to ultimately, get the process going and keep it basically moving forward.
Simona, to talk about sort of the effect of the stories, or the impact, which is one of the things that Sven is also talking about. What kind of impact can we have, not just on journalists, but on audiences? What have you seen from the work that you've done? How are audiences responding to it? Are they using it? What impact are you seeing?
Well, that's a good thing to see impact of your work, of course, and we can actually measure it by measure how many people read our articles and how much time they spend in our articles, for example. And we already know that all the news that are like scientists found out that doesn't work, because you can't publish those news like every week. Nobody takes it seriously. And of course, as a journalist, you wish people would take it seriously, because it's a serious threat. And so as I mentioned, that we try to work in a different way and to use the graphics, not only follow the political steps or the rising temperatures. So we try to show the data and show the facts by graphics. And I have like one example. If you publish a long read, a really good and long article, like the reader would spend like 2 or 3 minutes in it. And if you do the same, but you put it in a graphics, in a scrollytelling, for example, which is quite a new, not new, but it's like a trending way how to publish your work, people would spend there like 6 minutes, which is good, because I think it's even more important in this topic. You really need, or you really want that your job has an impact, because even journalists, I think, can feel something like the climate anxiety and can realize it, but it's not really our job or our role to persuade people or something. We just need to do our job, and it's really good to see that you do it and people read it and maybe think of it, and I think it's very important for us.
Sven, one of the areas I know you wanted to talk about, and I think it's interesting to begin to make these connections between sort of large systems change, so coal, the sort of shifting away from coal in Germany for electrical power, but connecting sort of big systems change to the individual person when it comes to climate, because there's this I don't know if it's a battle, but there's this question of how does individual action then lead to sort of systemic change. So wondering if you can take us down the sort of your story around Germany and coal-fired power plants, and how you start to make those kinds of connections.
Yeah, that is actually a very good example of where you can connect, the sort of like top line decisions, the political decisions, a lot of business angles, and then you can go down all the way to individual, decisions, but also, how the impact is on individuals, because obviously the coal exit story is one that ultimately affects regions and people, and they can actually, out of fear for their jobs and their livelihood, become, a massive, opponent to swift action that might otherwise be really necessary for climate mitigation. And maybe, I don't know whether that works now, but I'll give it a try and share my screen. Because funnily enough, on this coal exit story, which we really covered extensively and which showcases, what we actually have on offer today, one of the next stories landed, which we covered. If you look on the left-hand side, I hope you can all see that. We had the first basically round of orderly switch-offs of hard coal plants through government auctions, which is ultimately, so to speak, the real start of the coal exit story. But Germany had decided, and that's why I think it's a really interesting example to look at, in 2018 to tackle its coal problem, which it has. It is a leader in renewables, but at the same time, it was still burning a lot of coal, which we know is one of the main drivers of carbon emissions. They've decided to go through a process which we call, the Coal Commission, where they brought in all the stakeholders to discuss how to do it in an orderly fashion that is fair and just to the regions and the people and to the businesses, and to obviously take into account all the necessary steps for climate action. And, this is a very, very complex story. And what we did is we really followed that story meticulously, every day, from day one, if you want, and we compiled everything in a big dossier where you could go and jump into that story when you were late to it or when you felt it was important. And so we did that, and we started something which we called the Commission Watch, because they put in a coal commission with all the stakeholders to discuss that. And if you look at it day by day, we followed it over 2 years, or a year and a half, basically, until they finally reached that agreement. And we explained, what their decision what the commission was, but also what their decision meant, and so on and so forth. But right from the start, we actually did much more. We were always available for our colleagues to call. And that was really interesting because those who picked up on that, did their own stories for their own countries. We had calls from the Czech Republic, for instance, where they wanted some background on something or someone to talk to. We had, an ITV journalist. I can say that because she actually thanked us for our support, for the support, running a TV feature in the UK on this process, and we just made ourselves available. If you want in a classic fixture way, something that foreign correspondents sometimes do, and that doesn't get a lot of good press for good reasons. But we make our sources and everything available in the hope that this yields to better stories in the relevant context abroad, because that's important. You cannot just take an example and say, hey, I'm here in Germany, I tell you what to do. Well, no, we need the translator. We need Simona to tell that the Czech audience, what might be interesting from the German example, and translate it into the national context. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So what we've done to foster that, we've invited journalists to have a look at it. We can do that because we're foundation funded, and I don't know whether we're going to talk about the money issues, that we as journalists all face. But, we could really share, we could bring them in and say, look, have a look around, talk to the people directly, and get your inspiration for the story on the ground, which is obviously still the best way to do your reporting, because if you speak to the people, you get a much better impression than, doing it over Zoom or the phone. Maybe that changes now, but we're actually thinking about doing now virtual journalism trips to the hotspots. We shouldn't use the word hotspots right now, to the interesting places of the energy transition. And again, as I've mentioned, ultimately, we got to a point where we could now say, talking about impact. The neat thing is, if you do that, if you open yourself up to these conversations with your audiences, be it other journalists or be it other experts. Actually, we also got calls from institutions that worked in the area. You get a sense for what actually is interesting to them and why they're interested, and then you can connect the dots again in your head and say, okay, so this solution seems to be really interesting, or this solution seems to be really not interesting, or maybe even something that is detrimental. So that is a neat example. I think this whole process of the coal phase out decision in Germany, we made that accessible, and I do think, from the responses we got, that really helped people to translate it into their national context, and then elsewhere to make sense of it and take the goods and the bads. I think this is a last thing I would underscore, that some people always think, we're not strictly speaking a solution journalism project, but one focused on the solution. But what I would always say, and that's true for all projects, and what I've heard today goes in the same direction, you need to be a rigorous journalist, even if you present the journalist that the solution stories. There is no way around fact checking, double checking, and being sure that what you write is really correct and true ultimately.
Great, thank you, Sven. Yeah, this idea, and one of the things that we teach in solutions journalism is that there's no silver bullet. There is no perfect solution, and when you are maybe presented with such a thing, you should rigorously report on it, rigorously look at it, because solutions journalism, from our perspective, is always evidence-based reporting. If a solution isn't working, it's still important to look at, but you always need to show whether that evidence. We actually have a great question from our attendees, and this is from Molly Cruz, and it's to both of you. Hi, Simona and Sven, who are your main audiences? Is it mostly young people or business people? And as important, and how do you make your stories applicable to larger demographics who might not usually be interested in climate or environmental stories? Simona, I'll let you take that first, and then Sven.
Mm-hmm. It's quite difficult to say who is our main audience. I would say everyone. We wish to be everyone, and it's. I think it's getting easier to get attention of people who would not be normally interested in climate change topics and issues, because it's something that everybody is related to. So we try to find stories, maybe on like a smaller scale, stories from small cities, stories from like particular people who are adapting or who are facing or fighting the impact of climate change. It should be something that people can relate to. Luckily, I said that Czechs are like nature lovers. They love to spend time outside. Like opinion polls, they say that environment and nature is right. It's rising importance among Czech people. So you should like you still need to search for topics. Even though climate change itself is one giant topic, you still need to look for topics. Even though you can write about transition, but it's always better to find a topic in this like more general topics, to write about certain people, to write about places and projects.
Great. And Sven, your audience, and then also how do you connect with audiences that maybe aren't as interested in climate or environmental topics?
Well, that is obviously the key question, because if we keep the information, the really important solutions within a very close circle, obviously we are not going to get there, whether it's the big political decisions or the small things individuals can do. Both need to be part of the debate in people's in democracies in particular, but everywhere actually in people's minds. Now, our direct audience, I would say, we see ourselves as an intermediary. We would say that we want, as I said, we hope that journalists in their various countries and in their various publications pick, like from a menu, what they need from the stories we offer to them, and then apply them to whatever their specific question is. If you're talking about tar sands in Canada, I have no idea, how you address your public in Canada well, but maybe some of the lessons from a coal commission could be interesting for Canada. That's something the Canadian journalists, that transfer, that must be done by the Canadian journalists. And the same is true. We have a very ardent, followership, if you want, in the NGO and business community, actually, which I thought was quite interesting. The business community itself is quite interested in looking at the overarching storyline, but also at these solution elements. And again, I would hope, and that, I do think from what we can see, there are indications that they're doing that they pick what they need, and then they become the translators. They are, the ones to use that news story, that fact sheet, that background material, and translate it into the language of their specific audience and their specific constituency, because that's really important. That if you want to, like journalism in general, we don't think that way, but you need a little street credibility with your audience ultimately to reach them. If you're just sitting somewhere in Berlin like I do, again, do I really have some clout with people in India, or does my opinion actually count, or my writing or our team's writing count even in Austria? So you need people, journalists or other communicators, to use that and then put it in the context where it fits in a language that fits the local audience.
One of the questions that I think was sort of maybe buried a little bit in the Q&A, I'm going to bring up to the front. There's a question around solutions journalism, and I know both of you don't necessarily work within sort of our constructed solutions journalism network, but thinking about, are you really focused on working examples, things that are working now, versus sort of new issues, things that are coming, but maybe aren't solutions that have been put into place? How important is it to have a solution on the ground that's working versus something that may be coming is an idea for the future in terms of climate? Sven, if you want to, does that question make sense?
May I pick up on that first very briefly, because I find that really fascinating. I usually would say you need both. Very Solomonic answer. You obviously, to speed up the whole process, you need to apply working solutions quickly. And if you can prove, if your journalism makes that story accessible and it can then travel elsewhere, this is an important first step to accelerate the necessary action to mitigate climate change. So I would say this is really important to have as many good examples and as many good solution stories that actually show already that they work. Now, that will not be enough. And I attended an event here in Berlin, I think about a year ago, which I thought was really fascinating because I wouldn't have known what to write about it actually. And I didn't, because I thought it was called, unfortunately, the Manhattan Project on Climate, where they really brought in ideas that are not proven yet, but that have the sort of, the researchers or the developers who were involved in that thought that they may, have the potential to really go and revolutionize certain elements of the energy sector or so on. And yeah, you need to look at those. And I handed all the examples to my correspondents and said, if you write about steel making and how to, get carbon emissions out of steel making, there is a guy at the MIT in Boston, or in Cambridge, actually, Massachusetts, and he says he's developed a way of making steel at almost no carbon emission in a way that is totally novel. Can I judge that? No. Has he proven that? Probably not, but it's worth having that in mind and discussing that with the relevant communities. And then we get to the point where Priti was, you have to talk then to experts and see, how realistic is that? And then yes, we should report on it if we have a certain level of scientific certainty that this could work. And we will have a lot of these discussions going forward on things we're not talking about a lot these days, which are carbon capture and storage, or even large-scale geoengineering solutions, which will be thrown at us at some point, and then we have to make an assessment whether this is a solution or whether it's another problem.
Mm-hmm. Simona, any thoughts from you on sort of, for your audience, is it about solutions that are working right now, or sort of maybe not the Manhattan Project, but let's call it the moonshot, these big ideas that have yet to even be put into practice? What works best for your audience?
But me personally, I'm very interested in like a solution that might to come, but I'm afraid that it could be a bit, for some people, it could be quite distant concern and something they can't even imagine. I don't know if it's only like Czech thing, but the public discussion here is not that developed, I'm afraid. I mean that there are still a lot of skeptics. There are still a lot of people who don't believe, I don't know, that it's not happening or it's not caused by human. But I think that like what works better with the audience is to report on things that are actually happening than on things that might help in the future.
Great. There's another question that was sort of in kind of collapsed within it. Another great question that I think goes to what we mean by we're covering solutions. But the question is, what does it tell us about governance in a society when journalism needs to produce solutions? So I want us to be careful, is like, we're not creating these solutions, we're covering the solutions. But I still think it gets at a really interesting issue of what is the government's role in making certain that an audience or their citizens understand what they're doing and what is happening in their countries. Sven, Simona, I don't know what your, any responses to that?
That's very difficult. I mean, sometimes you really feel like the journalists are inventing the solution, not just covering, because otherwise you would have nothing to cover. No, I'm kidding. I mean, like, you can cover solutions on smaller scale, as I said, like individuals doing something. But I don't really, I don't know if it's maybe just me, I don't really see solutions here on the governmental level, but we can take examples from, I don't know, other countries, and it could work. But it's still different because every country faces different issues. I mean, you can write about how the Netherlands are coping with the rising sea levels, which is like great, but you can't really do it here. So that can be an inspiration, but I don't really see it on a governmental level here. Might be a problem.
Sven, any response to that question?
Well, I can only agree with both of you, and maybe add that we should always be aware of our role as journalists. As it's not our job to create solutions, and certainly not our job to push individual solutions, regardless of what's happening with them, and not dropping the ball then once you just throw it in the debate and then you walk away. I mean, you need to monitor, that you need to track these solutions, whether they work or not. I mean, this is the coal exit story in Germany is exactly what we're doing. We now keep looking every step, is that going the right direction? Is it going fast enough? Is it going the way it was planned? So this is what journalism should be doing. We shouldn't be obviously the cheerleader for something that is unproven, especially, and be critical about that. And that requires, I think, I would always encourage people to be as transparent as possible about your source, your interests, your funders, but also about the things you do know and you don't know. I mean, why not write in the story, this is what we know, but actually, on this solution, this is what we don't know. and this could be a risk. So, that for me belongs in a good solution story as well. But then, follow up with it. Just not let your readers sit there and think like, now he told me that, and now what? We need to follow up on these things. And too often you read something in 2005 about a great invention, and then you hear nothing for 15 years. That is obviously, not ideal, because, you need the persistence, and then, also the backing, obviously, from editors and funders and readers to stay on top of that and follow, through with these individual solutions.
And may I add something? Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
You can even discover a new solution, like discover already existing solution from the past. Like, for example, I wrote an article about construction in times of climate change, and I wrote an article about a university campus here in Czech Republic, which was built like 14 years ago, and it was built on a field that first need to be. They needed to put the. Oh, sorry, I lost the word. Well, 14 years ago, there was no discussion about climate adaptation, but the campus was built in a way that nowadays it has like a water resistant system, which nowadays work as a great example of climate adaptation, but it wasn't 14 years ago. So 14 years ago, there were articles about this like super modern campus, and now you can write about it again, but in like a totally new way. So you can discover, I think, solutions. Mm-hmm. Discover.
Yeah, I think a couple of points to make as we kind of come to the end of our discussion is, when we talk about solutions journalism, we are talking about a response to an existing problem and a response that's happening now. It's very much evidence-based, and we're always very clear. When I teach, I really, I think limitations are at the heart of a solution story, because we never want to give people false hope. We never want to turn it into something that it's not. Again, that silver bullet. And then in thinking really about impact, and this goes to this discussion around activism and advocacy, I really think about solutions reporting as a way of catalyzing communities and catalyzing governments to be accountable. And how they choose to take our information is left in their hands. But what's important is for us to give them that information in the first place. As we come to the end, a couple of things I wanted to say, in addition to thanking Simona and Sven for their wisdom and their time. At Solutions Journalism Network, we will be building a specific toolkit for covering climate through a solutions journalism focus. So we'll be doing that probably mid-year next year. We'll have that available. And we're really moving forward to creating a community of practice around around this and collaborating with people like Simona and Sven and Priti and Julia and Catherine. So if anyone is interested in joining that community of practice, we'd love to have you. You can find me in the LinkedIn group. Again, thank you so much, Sven and Simona. It's been such a pleasure, and it's been great to spend an hour and a half with this audience. And I'll turn it back over to Dagmar.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.